Good morning, folks. Welcome back to Major Diesel, and a Merry Christmas. And I have an interesting little story to tell you today. Better get on with it here. Well, I got a surprise here for you. The other day, some friends of mine found something unique to give me for Christmas, and I thought I'd share a story about it with you. Because unbeknownst to them, it has a lot more meaning to me than what they even meant it to have. 1976, I had just turned 6 years old. My father went away with a neighbor one day and came home pulling a sad-looking little tractor. Now, this one doesn't look very sad, does it? But just listen to the story. This tractor had hardly any green paint on it. It was almost all either rust or black soot. One of the front tires was shot. One of the back tires had a great big blister on the side of it. They were pulling it with the neighbor's pickup. They pulled it into the yard, and Dad smiled over at me, and he says, "Well, son, this is an AR John Deere, and I think we can get it running." He proceeded to tell me how the man who had tried to start it the last time had lit fire to the decompression cocks on the side of the motor, hoping to burn up the gas because it was flooded. The whole tractor had become engulfed in flames, but it had quickly gone out. But he thought the tractor was ruined and had parked it. The engine was stuck solid. My father took a great big crowbar and a couple blocks of wood, and he carved little pieces of wood and put them into the two holes in the flywheel, and took the long crowbar and put it between the two holes in the flywheel and jumped up and down on it. And the engine started to turn. Then he unscrewed the decompression cocks from the side of the engine. Decompression cocks are right here on those little engines. And that left a hole that went right into the cylinders, and he pumped the cylinders full of light oil. The next day we went out and we turned the engine over and over again with the crowbar until he could turn it with the flywheel. Then he took the carburetor apart. It was all full of soot and ashes, and some of the pieces were broken. Then he told me that he thought probably the man didn't realize that the magneto should be repaired. So he took the magneto apart, took it into the house, laid it out on the kitchen table all in little pieces. We carefully filed the points and checked out the different pieces. He went to the John Deere dealer the next week, and he got some new parts for the carburetor and a few new pieces for the magneto. Then we put the magneto and the carburetor back together again and put it in the tractor. Then he took the fuel line off of the fuel tank. The rubber line that somebody had put on there had burned off. He took the rubber line away and made his own little line out of copper pipe and brass fittings. And he took the bowl off of the sediment bowl on the bottom of the gas tank and cleaned it. Took the fitting right out of the tank and put a little screen up inside the tank on top of the fitting. He cleaned out the fitting really good. And then he poured some gasoline into the small tank. Now these tractors are made with 2 gas tanks. If you look at this model, there's a gas tank back here where my finger is. There's another one up here on top. This one on top is the tank for running the tractor with. You can add kerosene to the main tank, to this tank up here, and drive the tractor all day on kerosene. But a gasoline engine won't start on cold kerosene. So this little tank back here has a special valve that you can hook it up to the carburetor just before you shut the tractor off and fill the carburetor up with gasoline so it'll start. Then when you start the tractor, it's running on gasoline from this tank. And after the tractor is running for about 5 minutes, you switch a valve over that is up here underneath this tank, and it runs off of what's in this tank. Now, instead of kerosene, sometimes my father added some diesel fuel to the gasoline. Sometimes he got fuel for free from the bulk fuel dealer when he drove the truck. He drove the bulk fuel truck. And he would come home with buckets of mixed diesel and gasoline. And he saved that to burn in the tractor when we were going to use it all day. After he had fixed the carburetor and the fuel lines and filled the tank up with gasoline, he turned this flywheel here by hand. First, he opened up these little valves I talked about on the side of the engine. And when he turned the flywheel around, it was really hard to turn. He couldn't even turn it a full turn by himself. He turned on it, and the tractor hissed, and gasoline went spraying out the side of the engine, out of the decompression cocks. And he pulled on it again, and it hissed again. And after about 3 or 4 pulls, he pulled it an extra time, and suddenly it kept on turning by itself, and it made a loud bang. And then the engine started to run. And it ran good. We used that tractor from 1976 until 1978. In 1978, we moved away. We drove the AR John Deere to the neighbor's and parked it in the back at his place because he had another one just like it, and he said he could use it for parts. And it sat there until a few years ago somebody decided to clean up that part of the bush and hauled a bunch of tractors to the junk. And I think that tractor ended up going to the junk. I'm not sure. But the thing that I remember most about the AR John Deere was the summer when I was 7. It was June of 77. We were making some hay at the neighbor's place. Dad had borrowed a square baler and square baled the hay, and the bales were all laying out in the field. The weather report was that it was going to rain that afternoon. So Dad took the baler back to the neighbors, came home, and hooked up to our hay wagon. The proportions are a bit off in this set of models, but this hay wagon is almost identical to the one that we had. It had a rack standard on the front, and we pulled it with horses quite often, and so it had a V up top here. And if anybody knows what that V is for, that V was for tying the reins when you had the wagon hooked to a horse and you wanted the horse to stand still while you got off the wagon. You did a half hitch on each side of the V for each individual rein, so that when you climbed back onto the wagon, you merely had to lift up on the reins, and the 2 half hitches came undone, and the reins were loose in your hand. One fluid movement. Anybody who has much experience with horses knows what that's all about. Anyway, we were pulling the wagon with the tractor that day. I was with Dad. We rode on the old AR. We got out to the field. It was starting to sprinkle a bit of rain. Dad looked around and he said, "If only the wagon could just wander around the field from bale to bale." He said, "But the tractor won't really do it by itself." I said, "But Dad, I can drive the tractor." Dad looked down at me and he said, "Can you?" He said, "Sit up here in the seat." So I sat up in the seat and I grabbed the steering wheel. "Well," he said, "when you drive a John Deere, you don't just steer," he said. "You have to use one hand to pull the clutch." I said, "I can pull the clutch." I reached over. There was a long lever over here. It's broke off on this model. But there was a long lever over here right next to the fender. And I grabbed a hold of the lever to show Dad that I could pull the clutch. And I pulled on it with all my might. And that pulley, I'll just show you on the other side of the model here. There's a pulley down here. Underneath the fender, and you could see it. On ours, this little piece of the fender was missing, and you could see the pulley turn. The pulley just kept on spinning. Dad said, "Pull harder, pull harder." I hung on it as hard as I could, and I couldn't pull it. So he reached over and helped me pull a little bit, and it went pop! And a little brake pad on the side of the pulley pushed against the wheel, and the wheel stopped. "I'll put it in gear," he said, "and then we'll see if you can drive it." So he put it in low gear. He gave it just a little bit of throttle so it wouldn't stall, and he said, "Okay, see if you can push the clutch." I pushed and pushed on that lever. I stood up alongside the seat, and I leaned it forward as hard as I could on the lever, and I fell right over the lever and landed in the toolbox. And the tractor didn't move. Dad just laughed a little bit. "Okay," he said, "you sit on the seat, grab the steering wheel." He said, "When I'm ready to go, I'll just push the lever and jump out of the way." So he pushed the lever. Told me where to steer the tractor so I was closest to the hay bales. Then he jumped off and went back and threw all the hay bales onto the wagon as fast as he could. The tractor was just creeping around the field. It was all I could do to steer the thing. It might be a small tractor, but for a 7-year-old boy, it was a lot of work to steer. It had no power steering, and it was driving slow. And the field was bumpy. But the tractor didn't wander off into the willow trees, and we got all the hay bales picked up. And when we were all done, Dad said, "Okay, you can stop now." And I hung on the clutch lever, and he laughed. And he ran over and slipped between the tractor and the wagon and grabbed the clutch lever and stopped the tractor. Then he lifted me up onto the wagon with him while he carefully placed all the bales so they wouldn't fall off on the way home. It wasn't a full load, but it was enough, and we had picked up all the bales we had made that morning, just as it started to rain. So, Dad quickly stuck the tractor in high gear, and we headed off down the road to go home. And that, folks, was the first time that I steered or drove a vehicle. So you can imagine my surprise when my friends gave me this model tractor for Christmas, and they didn't realize that this model is an exact replica of the first vehicle I ever drove. Isn't that a neat story? Now I got a picture for you here of the real hay wagon, just to prove to you that that hay wagon did exist. This is the wagon that we loaded with hay behind the AR John Deere. Now, like I said, we normally pulled that wagon with a horse. This horse happens to be the neighbor's horse. The reason we got a picture of it, because my mom didn't have a camera for quite a while, we got this picture because the neighbor said, I want you to hook up and use my horse, and I want to get a really good picture of it hooked to your hay wagon. So Dad went and got a load of hay bales with the horse, and the neighbor got a picture of him driving the hay wagon. That's my dad on top of the load. And you see the post in the front of the hay wagon standing up there where he would tie the reins. That wagon is still there. It sits behind my uncle's place back in the woods. The hay rack is all rotten. But it's interesting. The frame and bottom of that wagon is from an 1800s spring wagon. It was made to have large wooden wheels, not the wide wagon wheels that we often see pictures of in the West, but the narrower, high-speed buggy wheels. They're still 3 feet across. Somebody found out that the hubs fit nicely into the hubs of Nodwell idler wheels. Nodwell idler wheels have rubber tires without any treads, and the rubber tires run inside of tracks. So they had got a set of Nodwell rubber tired wheels to put on this old spring wagon. And that's how we bought the spring wagon. My father put new Nodwell rubber wheels on it, rubber tires on it, and we used it for years behind the horse. In fact, the horses that I remember pulling this wagon were usually half the size of this big draft horse. The horses that we used were usually ponies. So, a story from my past to liven up your Christmas. Merry Christmas, everybody. Well, folks, there we have it. Christmas memories of our 1937 John Deere AR tractor we had when I was a 6-year-old boy. And that's all for today from me here at Major Diesel. You stay subscribed. I'll try to be posting more videos of our family's shenanigans with tractors further on. So, this is Mystery Cowboy sending you Christmas greetings. Stay tuned.